At my brother's wedding, my father leaned into the microphone, smiled at 200 guests, and said, "We always knew Daniel was going places. As for our other one, well, let's just hope she figures it out someday." The room laughed. My aunt laughed. The officiant laughed. I was sitting in the third row, in a bridesmaid dress I had paid for myself, holding a bouquet of white peonies, and I smiled too, because that's what you do when you've been trained your whole life to pretend it doesn't hurt. My name is Nicole. I'm 31 years old. I live in Vancouver, and I spent most of my childhood being the other one. I want to be clear about something before I tell you the rest of this story. I didn't grow up in poverty. I didn't grow up with parents who screamed or threw things. We had a detached house in Oakville, Ontario. My father was a civil engineer. My mother taught part-time at a community college. By every external measure, we were a normal, stable, upper-middle-class Canadian family. And that's exactly what made it so hard to name. Because when everything looks fine from the outside, you start to believe the problem is you. My brother Daniel is 4 years older than me. From the time I can remember, the rules were different for him. Not dramatically, not in a way you could point to and say, "Look, there it is. That's the favoritism." It was quieter than that. It was the way my mother would say his name when he walked into a room bright, like she'd been waiting. The way my father would ask about his hockey tournaments at dinner, and then check his phone while I talked about school. It was Daniel getting driving lessons from my father on weekends while I was told to just sign up for a class. It was 100 small things that, on their own, meant nothing. Together, they meant everything. The comparison started early. Daniel was outgoing, athletic, funny in the way that made adults feel comfortable. I was quieter, more likely to be found reading in my room, more likely to ask questions that made people uncomfortable. In grade 7, I asked my father why we'd never talked about my grandmother's side of the family, why there were no photos of her anywhere in the house. He looked at me like I'd done something wrong and said, "You always have to dig into things, don't you?" Daniel never dug into things. Daniel let things be. And for a long time, I thought that made him the better person. By the time I was in high school, the dynamic had calcified. Daniel was predestined for something great. I was the uncertain one, the question mark, the kid my parents seemed to regard with a kind of low-grade bewilderment, like they weren't quite sure how I'd ended up in their house. I wasn't a bad student. I wasn't in trouble. I just wasn't Daniel. The sentence I heard most often growing up was, "Why can't you be more like your brother?" I heard it when I quit competitive swimming at 15 because I'd developed a repetitive strain injury in my shoulder, and my mother thought I was being dramatic. I heard it when I chose to apply to Simon Fraser University in BC instead of staying in Ontario to attend Queen's, which was where Daniel had gone. I heard it the summer before I left for university, when I told my parents I was thinking about studying communications and journalism. My father looked at Daniel, actually turned his head, and looked at Daniel, as if Daniel was the one who'd be answering, and then said to me, "That's not really a career, Nicole." Daniel picked something real. Daniel had picked civil engineering, like my father. I left for Vancouver, that September, with 2 checked bags, a laptop, and the particular kind of relief that only people who've spent years feeling like a guest in their own home will understand. I called home every Sunday for the first year. The calls got shorter and shorter, not because I stopped wanting connection, but because every conversation managed to circle back to Daniel. What Daniel was doing. How well Daniel was doing. Had I heard that Daniel had been promoted? That Daniel had started dating someone serious? That Daniel was thinking about buying a place? I wasn't jealous of Daniel. I want to make that clear, because it's the easy thing to assume, and it's not the truth. I was grieving. I was grieving the version of my parents. I kept hoping to find the ones who would ask about my internship at the community newspaper in New Westminster, the ones who would say my name, with that brightness I'd heard, reserved for my brother, my entire life. I kept waiting. They kept not delivering, and I kept telling myself that the next visit home would be different. The wedding was in June, 3 years after I graduated. Daniel was 29. His fiancée, Priya, was someone I actually liked, warm, sharp, the kind of person who remembered details about your life and asked about them. She had treated me like a real person from the first time we met, which honestly made her more family to me than some people I shared DNA with. I was asked to be a bridesmaid. I said yes. I flew back to Ontario, took a week off work from the communications firm in Vancouver, where I'd been working for 2 years, paid for my own dress, my own flight, my own hotel because my parents' house was full of out-of-town relatives and there simply wasn't space. That last part stung in a way I filed away and didn't examine too closely. The ceremony was at a venue in Burlington, on the lake. It was beautiful. Priya was radiant. Daniel cried when she walked down the aisle, and I was genuinely moved by that, standing at the front beside the other bridesmaids, watching my brother become someone's husband. For a few hours I let myself just be a person at a wedding. Then came the reception. Then came the speeches. My father had insisted on speaking, even though the tradition was for the best man and the maid of honor. Priya's parents had already given their toast. My father stood up, adjusted the microphone, and for the first 3 minutes, he was fine. He talked about Daniel's childhood. He told the hockey story. He always told the hockey story. He made people laugh. He raised his glass toward Priya and said something gracious about welcoming her to the family. And then he said it. We always knew Daniel was going places. That was never in question. As for our other one, and here he paused, and I watched him smile, the smile of someone who thinks they're being charming, who thinks this is a bit, who has no idea what they're about to do well. Let's just hope she figures it out someday. 200 people laughed. I did not move. I held my glass. I kept my face completely still. I was aware of Priya's maid of honor, beside me glancing over, and I did not look at her, because I knew that if I met someone's eyes, I would not be able to hold it together. I found a point on the far wall, a sconce light, one of those amber glass ones they use in event venues, and I stared at it. I breathed. After the speech, my father sat down to applause. Daniel, to his credit, looked uncomfortable. He caught my eye briefly, and then looked away, which told me everything about what he was prepared to do. Priya was not looking at me, which I understood it was her wedding day, and she could not fix this. My mother was smiling at something my aunt had leaned over to say to her. Nobody was looking at me, which was, in a horrible way, very on brand. I made it through the first dance. I made it through dinner. I helped bustle Priya's dress when she needed it, and I held her bouquet, and I danced when the DJ played something danceable, and I did everything a bridesmaid is supposed to do. Then, around 9:30, I told Priya I wasn't feeling well, which was true in every way that mattered, gave her a real hug, and left. I drove my rental car back to the hotel on the lakeshore. I sat in the parking lot for a long time without getting out. I called my best friend Cam, who lives in Kitsilano, who has known me since second year of university, who has heard every version of every story about my family. She picked up on the second ring. I told her what had happened. She said very quietly, "Nicole, you don't have to go back there. I already knew that. I think I'd known it for a long time. But sometimes you need someone to say it out loud." I did not go back to my parents' house. Before I flew home to Vancouver, 2 days later, I texted my mother to say I'd been overwhelmed by the trip and needed to head back early. She replied, "Okay, safe flight." That was it. I landed at YVR on a Tuesday afternoon, and I made a decision on the drive back to my apartment in East Van. I was not going to do this anymore. Not the Sunday calls that weren't really about me, not the visits that left me feeling like a stranger, not the performance of being fine. I was 31 years old, and I was done arranging myself around people who had never once arranged themselves around me. I didn't send a long letter. I didn't call and give a speech. I simply stopped. Stopped calling. Stopped responding to the group family text. Stopped flying home for Christmas, which I'd done every single year, including the years I really couldn't afford it. I told my brother, in a short email, that I needed space and that I hoped he and Priya were well. He replied with one line, "I understand. I'm here if you need me." I appreciated that more than I expected to. The first few months were strange. There's a kind of guilt that comes with choosing silence, even when the silence is the healthiest thing you've ever chosen. I'd be in the middle of an ordinary Tuesday making coffee, answering emails, walking my dog, a 3-year-old shepherd mix named Biscuit, who I had adopted the previous spring, and I'd feel it, this pull, this reflex to pick up the phone and call home. Not because I missed the dynamic, because I'd spent 30 years being conditioned to maintain it. I was in therapy by that point, working with a counselor in Commercial Drive who specialized in family estrangement. Her name was Dr. Farida, and she had this way of reflecting things back to you that was infuriating in exactly the right way. She said something in our third session that I've thought about many times since. She said, "The grief you're feeling isn't grief for what you lost. It's grief for what was never there, and for the amount of yourself you spent trying to make it appear." I stayed away for 5 years. I built a life in that time. I was promoted twice at the communications firm, eventually becoming a senior account manager. I bought a small condo in Mount Pleasant, which, in the Vancouver market in my late 20s, felt like an actual miracle and required every dollar I had saved, plus a very stressful conversation with a mortgage broker. Cam got married to her partner in a small ceremony at Deer Lake Park in Burnaby, and I was her maid of honor, and her father gave a speech in which he talked about both of his daughters with exactly the same warmth, and I had to excuse myself briefly to cry in the bathroom, not from sadness exactly, but from the recognition of what that was supposed to look like. I dated. I had a serious relationship for 2 years with a man named Marcus, who was kind and funny and ultimately not the right fit, and we ended things in the way that decent people sometimes end things: sad, mutual, and without drama. I had friends. I had a neighborhood I loved, and a morning coffee place where the barista knew my order, and Sunday farmers markets at Trout Lake, and hikes in Lynn Canyon with Biscuit. I had, quietly and gradually, built a real life. I did not think about my parents every day. That's the thing nobody tells you about estrangement. The silence eventually becomes just silence, not a wound, just an absence that you stop bumping into. I thought about Daniel sometimes, wondered how he and Priya were doing. I hoped they were happy. I found out they were, via the text I received on a Thursday evening in November, not from Daniel, and not from my mother, but from my Aunt Carol, who is my father's sister, and who had always treated me with a more straightforward kind of affection than my parents managed. She texted, "Nicole, I think you should know. Daniel and Priya had a baby girl 3 weeks ago. Everything is fine. The baby is healthy. I thought you'd want to know. Also, your mother had a fall in September. She's recovering, but she's been having a hard time." I sat with that text for 4 days. I want to explain what those 4 days felt like, because it wasn't simple. There was a part of me that wanted to not respond at all, to let the information exist at a distance, to protect what I had built. There was another part of me that thought about a baby who was also, technically, my niece, a person who had not been at that wedding and had not laughed at that speech and had nothing to do with any of it. And there was a smaller, older part of me that thought about my mother having a fall, being in pain, recovering alone, and felt something involuntary. I called my Aunt Carol. She told me more. My mother had slipped on the back deck in September, fractured her wrist badly enough to need surgery, and had been dealing with the recovery while also managing my father, who had had a minor cardiac event in August, nothing catastrophic, the doctors said, but enough to require medication and a significant change in lifestyle. My father, who had never voluntarily changed anything in his life, was apparently not handling this transition gracefully. Daniel and Priya were overwhelmed with a newborn. Priya's parents lived in Calgary. The extended family was doing what they could, but my aunt's voice had something in it when she said doing what they could that communicated a fairly clear picture. She wasn't asking me to go back. She was careful about that. She said, twice, "I'm just telling you what's happening. Whatever you decide is up to you." I spent 2 weeks deciding. I talked to Dr. Farida, who did not tell me what to do, but helped me understand what I actually wanted, versus what I felt obligated to do, versus what might be the beginning of something better. I talked to Cam, who said, "If you go, go for yourself, not for them." I walked Biscuit along the seawall 3 nights in a row, and thought about who I was now, versus who I had been when I left, and whether I was sturdy enough for this, and what I would need in order to do it without dissolving back into the person who smiled through a microphone joke in a Burlington event venue. I decided to go, not because they deserved it, Not because the past had been resolved, it hadn't. But because I was no longer the person who needed their validation, which meant I could walk back in without handing it to them. I drove, actually. I took 2 weeks off work, packed the car, drove the Trans-Canada with Biscuit in the back seat, stopped in Calgary for a night to see a university friend, crossed into Ontario on a gray Thursday morning, with coffee from a Tim Hortons drive-thru, and pulled into Oakville in the early afternoon. My mother opened the door before I reached it. Her right wrist was still in a soft brace. She looked older than I remembered, not dramatically, but noticeably, in the way people age when you haven't seen them for 5 years. She looked at me for a moment and then said, "You came. Not thank you. Not I missed you. Just, you came." As if she had not quite believed it would happen. I said, "I came." And I meant it in more than one way. My father was in the living room in the chair he'd always used, the brown leather one by the window. He looked smaller. This surprised me more than I expected it to, because my father had always occupied a large amount of space, not physically. He was not a big man, but energetically, in the way he held a room. That quality had dimmed. He looked up when I came in and said, "Nicole, just my name." I said, "Hi, Dad." We did not hug, but we were in the same room, and we were speaking, and that was more than we'd managed in 5 years. The first 3 days were effortful and careful. We talked around the surface of things: my drive, my condo, my job, the housing market, Biscuit, who became an unlikely social lubricant because my father, who had never in my memory been particularly warm with animals, seemed genuinely taken by my dog, in a way that gave us something neutral to talk about. My mother cooked, badly with one hand, and refused help with the characteristic stubbornness that used to infuriate me, and now, somehow, seemed less monstrous than simply human. On the 4th evening, I was in the kitchen helping clean up after dinner, and my mother was sitting at the table with her brace resting on the tablecloth, and she said quietly, not looking at me, "I've thought about the wedding, what your father said." I kept my hands in the sink. I didn't turn around. She said, "I should have said something. That night, I should have walked over to you and said something." She paused. "I didn't, and I've thought about that." It was not a full apology. It didn't account for 30 years. It didn't say the things that would have been most useful to hear when I was 12, or 17, or 22. It was a small, partial, imperfect thing, offered by a woman in her 60s with a fractured wrist who was not built for large emotional gestures. I turned off the tap. I turned around. I said, "I know." I didn't say it's okay, because it wasn't, not entirely. I didn't say I forgive you, because forgiveness is a process, not a sentence, and I was not going to hand over something I hadn't finished earning yet. I said I know, which was true. I believed her that she had thought about it, and that had to be enough for that evening. I met Priya and Daniel's daughter the next day. She was 6 weeks old and her name was Annika, and she had Daniel's ears, which is a very specific observation, but it was the first thing I noticed. Priya put her in my arms, and I stood in their living room in Mississauga and held a person who had no idea any of this had happened, who was entirely brand new, and I felt something loosen in my chest that I hadn't known was held tight. Daniel and I talked properly for the first time in 5 years, after dinner when Priya had taken Annika upstairs. We sat at his kitchen table with decaf coffee. Daniel was doing decaf now, for solidarity with Priya, which I found both slightly funny and quietly touching, and he said, "I'm sorry I didn't say anything at the wedding." I said, "Why didn't you?" He said, "Because I didn't know how to, and because I think I'd spent so long in that family telling myself it wasn't as bad as it was, that I couldn't see what was right in front of me." He looked at the table. "That's not an excuse. I just want you to know I see it now." I said, "Why now?" He said, "Annika, honestly, the day she was born, I kept thinking, what if I do this to her? What if I make her feel like she's the backup? And then I thought about you, and I couldn't stop thinking about you." I didn't cry, but it was close. What I want to tell you, and this is the part I think about the most, now, in the months since that trip, is that going back didn't fix everything. My father has not had his reckoning moment. He has not sat me down and walked through every year of my childhood with clarity and remorse. He probably won't. He's 72. He's on cardiac medication, and he is not a man who excavates. There are people in the comments of videos like this one who will say that's not enough, that without a real apology none of this counts. And I understand that position because I held it for a long time. But here's what I found when I went back. I didn't need his excavation to feel whole. I needed to be the person who could walk into that house and know, with absolute certainty, that my worth had never actually been in his hands. The joke at the wedding hurt because I'd given them the power to hurt me. 5 years of building a real life had quietly, incrementally, taken that power back. I drove home to Vancouver on a Sunday. I stopped at the same Tim Hortons on the way. Biscuit slept in the back seat for most of Alberta. My mother texts me now, every week or so. Short texts. Not effusive, she's not a big texter. She uses full punctuation and sends them at odd hours, 7 a.m. on a Saturday, 11 p.m. on a Tuesday, as if the timing is chosen by impulse rather than intention. They say things like, "Biscuit looks good in that photo," or "Daniel says you gave Annika a stuffed bear, she loves it," or once, just, "Hope Vancouver is treating you well." I reply to all of them, it is not the relationship I deserved from the beginning, but it is a relationship I chose, on my own terms, with eyes open, as an adult woman who knows who she is. That feels like something. That feels, actually, like quite a lot. If you are sitting somewhere right now, recognizing this story, the third row, the smile you held in place, the Sunday calls that were never quite about you, I want to say something directly to you. The distance you created was not failure. It was survival. And if you ever decide to go back, make sure you go back as the person you built in the silence, not as the person they made you feel you were. Because that person was never real. That person was a story they told, into a microphone, in a room full of people who didn't know you. You know yourself. That's the whole thing. That's actually enough.